As you might guess, I'm very much looking forward to picking up Bishop Spong at the airport on Friday as he returns for his second visit, and this time for our 6th anniversary. Last year, Bishop Spong and I had just a few moments alone to reflect on the conference that we held here last year, which all in all was so successful that we decided to do it all over again, only make it twice as long. We got to meet a lot of our YouTube and iTunes listeners, some of whom traveled from as far away as California and Great Britain to be here with us. Though we had pastors from many surrounding states who traveled a long way to be here, I couldn't help noticing that there weren't any pastors from Springfield congregations other than my personal friend from the Unity Church. To which Bishop Spong replied that there were no Episcopal clergy present, in spite of the fact that he is the best-known living Episcopal bishop in the United States and demonstrably the most published Episcopal bishop ever in the world. I'm not trying to compare myself in any qualitative way to Bishop Spong, but we shared a moment of mutual sad recognition that though we have devoted our professional careers to a liberating mission of setting our peers free from the darkness of ancient creeds and killing dogmas, that we have at the same time alienated most of our immediate peers. Some of the pastors who have literally plagiarized my writing, some so severely that I've actually had to engage attorneys to make them stop claiming to have written my material, still will not speak to me when they see me in a coffee shop. The scholarship of progressive faith has existed in classrooms and graduate schools for a couple of hundred years. The goal of the Jesus Seminar was to bring the results of modern scholarship into the light of day and allow people who attend churches to have access to that kind of religion that would actually help them in their personal lives and which would help to transform the world into a more civil and healthy world. The writings of Karen Armstrong, Marcus Borg, Bishop Spong, John Dominic Crossan are the best-known popularizers from the Jesus Seminar, though Springfield's own Charles Hedrick was both a founding member of the seminar and one of its most prolific converts. Charlie joined the seminary out of professional interest in the topic, but in the early 1980s, Charlie would tell you, when he first became a member of the seminar, that he was still pretty solidly rooted in evangelical Baptist thinking, that kind of certainty that the Bible was a historically reliable document that spoke on behalf of a supernatural theistic God. It was the actual investigative work of the seminar itself that liberated Charles Hedrick from traditional thinking and has allowed him to produce scores of publications that now reside on the shelves of theological library schools all over the world. My publisher, Whitfin Stock, as I said, generously gives their authors 2 free copies of any book you write. I'm, of course, keeping one of those copies for myself, but since Charlie wrote the foreword to Progressive Faith and Practice, I had lunch with him this week and gave him the other copy with my sincere thanks for all of his help and guidance in getting the final form written. I sometimes refer to my regular lunch meetings with Dr. Hedrick as interrogations. It's a description that he always denies. This week, however, he was a bit more unguarded and confessed that his Socratic style of conversation has had the goal of chasing out of me any last vestiges of supernatural theistic thinking that still cast a shadow over my writing and preaching. There was a TED Talk broadcast on NPR. If you've never listened to the TED Talks, they come on public TV when you're supposed to be here, so don't you dare. But you can record them, but NPR broadcasts several of them. But there was one that they broadcast this week under the rubric of Disruptive Leadership. And they interviewed several unconventional thinkers, military leaders, politicians, authors, who've managed to change the course of history by refusing to play nice with the status quo, by refusing to be a part of a peer group that has incredible power to push you towards mediocrity. My academic history at Vanderbilt and Harvard pushed me to excellence, but I can tell you that regional ministers, area ministers, and clergy gatherings pushed you towards mediocrity. Anything that rose above just the absolute bare minimums was squashed and discouraged. There is huge social pressure towards conformity in almost all fields, certainly not just in religion. It's also present in science and in education and medicine and certainly in politics. We have ways of punishing people who get out of line. We tell little girls who express leadership that they are being bossy. Have you ever heard anyone call a boy bossy? See, we have this sense that you have a social norm for your behavior, and we will punish you if you get out of it. We tell innovators in the corporate world that they are not conforming to corporate culture and therefore will not be promoted, and their ideas will be ignored. One of my favorite quotes from the British philosopher Bertrand Russell is, "A reasonable person adapts himself to the world. An unreasonable person insists that the world adapt itself to him. Therefore, all progress depends on unreasonable people." Disruptive leadership is just that. It is a willingness to be unreasonable at crucial points where it really matters. One of the things that I learned from Dr. Todd Scheibel, who's the director of Borough Mental Health here, when I was on the board and we were battling small mental health agency against grand hospitals, he told me what he called the madman theory. And he said, you have to impress upon your adversaries, critics, enemies, that you are crazier than they are. You have to make them believe that you will absolutely fight this issue down to the last breath and that you will not give in for any reasonable circumstances, that you are crazy enough to take it all the way to the end. And I have found that at times, being willing to be the craziest person in the room is the only way to survive. When we are told that we have to respect everyone else's beliefs, and it's one of the great myths of our time. We say that everyone's religion is a matter of personal choice, and you've got to respect everyone else's religion. We've seen how that gets played out. Recent Supreme Court decision that granted the right to discriminate against female employees of Hobby Lobby based on the personal and scientifically ill-informed religion of the family that owns Hobby Lobby. We're told, well, in Supreme Court arguments, said they ardently hold these stupid beliefs. They don't actually understand how pregnancy happens, but their misinformation about how pregnancy happens has to be respected legally because they hold it ardently. I can't wait for some voodoo practicing family to own a large corporation and impose those religious views on their employees. But governments talk about freedom of religion, and they will even give us tax-exempt status as long as we are focused on pie in the sky and the by and by, as long as we teach homophobia and misogyny. But as soon as we address the real issues of illegal wars, pollution, political corruption, racism, then they will investigate us, imprison us, sometimes assassinate us. But as is more commonly done in the United States these days, they just marginalize you. We are supposed to take our tax-exempt status and go sit in a corner and talk about gays and why women, what was that congresswoman recently, I think she was from North Carolina, that said that men have to bring issues down to women's levels so that they can, every once in a while I realize that Missouri is not the only state with really bad members of Congress. That is, however, simply a way of cutting off any significance to a religious voice. In today's world where religious beliefs fuel everything from bigotry to hate crimes to wars and suicide bombers, it's more important than ever for rational people to speak up. No matter how impolite or disruptive it may seem to the status quo, we have to confront irrational and ancient religious myths with science-based truth and critical thinking. I don't ever want to be disagreeable just to be disagreeable. There's nothing laudable about being a difficult person or a person who always provokes controversy for the sake of getting attention or just being a fly in the ointment. However, there is great value to disruptive leadership. Sometimes there's a certain amount of deconstruction necessary before you can meaningfully reconstruct society. Being a disruptive leader will not typically make you very popular, especially among those who wish that they could do what you're doing, if only they had enough courage to do it. I took our wisdom lesson today from To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a great quote about how traditional religious beliefs can create a demonic society, but I really used it to represent the whole book. Harper Lee published that book in 1960. When Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were providing disruptive leadership in the midst of the civil rights movement. But those of us who lived through those times of great social change can also remember the huge impact of movies like A Raisin in the Sun and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. We can remember that novels, and To Kill a Mockingbird was one of the most popular, it was a Pulitzer Prize winning novel, one of the most popular novels in America in 1960. Disruptive leadership, the kind of leadership that refuses to acquiesce to the status quo, sometimes comes from political leaders, though not usually. Sometimes it comes from religious leaders. True of the black church, not so true of the white church. But more likely, in times of great social change, it came from novels and movies. You think about Philadelphia. The impact that that movie had in 1991, when that same year the newspaper at Evangel University said that AIDS was God's response to homosexuality. You have a major church, a global church, saying that the Lord God Almighty kills homosexuals. But you've got a movie out of Hollywood that's saying, maybe we need to rethink this. So you see a lot of the disruptive leadership comes from non-traditional sources. Sometimes it comes from philosophers, but anybody in the room other than me bought a book of philosophy in the last 5 years? Anybody? Thank you. You and me. We need to get coffee. Now, I can tell you, I can stand here right now without notes, quote from messages delivered by Malcolm X. I can quote from sermons delivered by Martin Luther King. I cannot, however, recall a single word from any sermon I heard in person. I grew up in the 60s. I went to church every Sunday. My mother was the secretary. When we had Sunday night services, we went to those too. When we had Wednesday night meetings, we went to those. I had a long chain of Sunday school pins, and most of you don't even know what those are. But if you didn't miss Sunday school for a year, you got a bar to indicate I have nothing going on in my life and I never go on vacation. And I had a long chain of them. During those years, if the topic of racism, integration, civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, environmental concerns, immigration concerns, the war in Vietnam, if it was mentioned in my church, I don't remember it. I don't think it happened. The church is guilty of having stood on the sidelines in times of great social upheaval and crisis, protecting its own existence, when in fact the church should have been way out ahead of the novelists, the movie producers, and certainly the politicians. For us, there is no excuse for failing to provide disruptive leadership in the here and now when corporations are writing laws that deregulate their abuse of their employees and the pollution of the earth, as we will be voting on this week. When politicians are trying to undo most of the progress that we made in voters' rights, civil rights, and women's rights over the past 2 generations, when mainstream religion is more devoted to pie-in-the-sky nonsense than ever before. We were talking just last week. A couple of our folks here are retired Methodist pastors. I spent nearly 30 years as a Disciples of Christ pastor. These were liberal intellectual church traditions 30 years ago. They have become more pie-in-the-sky denial of reality, rejection of anything that actually is relevant anywhere on earth to anybody than any institution that's existed in my lifetime, which makes it all the more important for those of us who have chosen to live in the light, who have come out of the dark cave of religious dogma, social prejudice, cannibalistic capitalism, and warmongering foreign policy. We've got to love each other and stick together and enjoy being in community so that the prophetic voice is not snuffed out in our generation. This week, we will celebrate 6 years of being disruptive leaders in the religious world. We started with a mission of having an impact on Springfield, Missouri, and almost accidentally have been introduced to the world. I look forward this week to meeting some of our friends who have been a part of our community only through the vehicle of recording devices and videos, who will travel to be with us here next weekend. Our campus will be a beehive of activity for 3 days, and some of our friends will hang on for a few days after the conference just so that we can get to know each other better and spend some time with each other. But when the tents have been taken down and the porta potties have been removed and emptied, hopefully, and all of our distant members have gone back to their homes, 2 or 3 dozen of us remain. And it remains to us to keep kicking at the darkness until it bleeds daylight.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.